Good evening, and welcome to tonight's program, Pathways to a Brighter Future for North Korea's Economy. I'm Tom Byrne, and I'm the President and CEO of the Korea Society. Nuclear-armed North Korea remains among the world's poorest countries. Its leadership from time to time has championed economic development, but has not made much progress, especially relative to South Korea, needless to say, and also its East Asian neighbors who have successfully embarked upon reform, Mongolia, China, Vietnam, for example. So can North Korea's leadership pivot to economic reform for the benefit of its 25 million people? To speak about this and more, we are very happy to welcome today's speakers. They're a dream team, I think, of experts on North Korea, and I think you'll enjoy hearing their perspectives. We have Professor Kim Byung-Yeon, who is at the Department of Economics at Seoul National University and author of Unveiling the North Korean Economy, Collapse and Transition. He researches transitional economies, paying particular attention to North Korea and former socialist countries. Brad Babson worked for the World Bank for 26 years before retiring in 2000, and has studied the North Korean economy and written extensively on economic perspectives on the integration of North Korea into the international community. He currently teaches at Bowdoin College in Maine, and he serves on the advisory council of the Korean Economic Institute of America, and he had served as chair of the DPRK Economic Forum at the U.S. Korea Institute, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And last but not least is our good friend Peter Ward. He's a writer and a researcher focusing on the North Korean economy as well as a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna. He spends about as much time as anybody, probably as everybody combined, poring over North Korean economic journals, regulations as humanly possible, and brings some great insights from his research on the original documents that speak about the economy and economic reform and economic regulation. The Korea Society team is grateful to the Uni Korea Foundation, whose support helped make this program possible. We are also happy to note that we have partnered with Columbia University's Apex Study Center for this program. So we thank them for their help in spreading the word about tonight's event. And last but certainly not least, we want to thank you all of our viewers, for joining us. At about the 30-minute mark, we'll turn to audience questions. Some of them we have already on hand. They've been emailed into us. And the Q&A will be moderated by our policy director, Jonathan Corrado. We've already collected a good deal of questions, as I mentioned, but please feel free to keep sending them to policy@koreasociety.org. Now I'm going to turn to the panel to start the discussion. For my first question, I'd like to start by asking for everyone's quick assessment of where the economy stands today. Byung-Yeon, if we could start with you. What do we learn about the status of the economy from the reporting on the Eighth Party Congress and the plenary meeting?
Thank you, Tom. Before the Eighth Party Congress, I had three questions in my mind. First, will Kim Jong-un's economic policies go forward, stand still, or go backward? Second, what are the economic situations officially revealed? Third, to what extent do North Korean policymakers understand how to run the economy? As regards the first question, it appears that the Kim Jong-un decided to go backward. At the Congress, he emphasized North Korea is a self-reliant and planned economy and unified control of the state over the economy. Having said that, I don't think Kim's decision is grand reversal from markets to plan, because I regard his earlier pragmatic policies aimed at taking advantage of markets, not advancing them to the prime force in the economy. In addition, I don't believe he will be able to eradicate market activities, which already became too big, even compared with Kim's power. As regards second question, Kim Jong-un unexpectedly revealed a real figure that implies the significant effect of the sanctions on the economy. I don't think it was his intention to publicly inform how the sanctions bite the economy, but perhaps accidentally, in the process of emphasizing production, serving for people in the form of housing construction, Kim mentioned that the planned target of cement production within 5 years is 8 million tons. It's quite rare that North Korean authorities officially provide real figures, not gross rates, not nominal figures. A long time ago, in 1980, Kim Il-sung said that we had a target to produce 20 million tons of cement until the end of 1980s. But now it's 8 million tons. Of course, Kim Il-sung's figure was quite exaggerated. And Kim Jong-un's figure, I think, is more realistic than his grandfather's. Assuming that the annual growth rate for new 5-year economic plan was supposed to be 9%. This means cement production in 2020 was 5.2 million tons. Bank of Korea estimates North Korea's cement production peaked in 2016 when it produced 7.1 million tons. That means from 2017 to 2020, last year, cement production declined by 25%. But as you know, the cement industry can be more self-reliant than other manufacturing industries because raw material is domestically produced and demand has been very high given construction boom in North Korea. But even this industry turned out to suffer from the sanctions and the pandemic to a large extent. The revelation of this figure was surprise gift to me, and also confirmed my prior findings on the large and negative effect of sanctions. Now for the third question, I think policymakers' understanding of the economy on the basis of party Congress document is limited, indeed a cause of concern. Their approach and rhetoric sound like old Stalin type in 1930s, and also Kim Il-sung's in 1960s to 80s. But economic structure had changed dramatically. If you look at the trade dependence ratio, North Korean economy has been quite open in terms of trade dependence ratio. It's not autarky, it's not self-reliant, but it's quite open before the sanctions. Also, households earn a lot of money, income from market activities. This is unprecedented any socialist economies in history. But still, their approach to the economy is old style, Stalin type, Kim Il-sung type. Actually, does not fit the realities. It is virtually impossible to transform this kind of economy to self-reliant economy or autarky. I think if they really pursue this policy, they would be further damage to already much suffering households. Thank you. I'll stop here. Tom, unmute.
You're muted. Tom, you're muted.
I guess I'll step in here.
No, it's okay. I got it, Jonathan. Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Brad, going back to the Congress and the 5-year plan, how do you evaluate these policies? Is this a step back, a step forward, a step sideways? What's going on in Kim Jong-un's mind regarding the economy?
Well, I think I was surprised that they had the party Congress so early in January before other things became more clear about, for example, the election in the United States. It was odd timing. The fact that Kim Jong-un began the year with an apology for the failure to meet the objectives and aspirations of the 5-year development strategy that was adopted in 2016 I think, set a tone of that underscored the disappointment in the management of the economy and the performance of the economy in recent years. And I think that even that the plan itself, while I do believe it builds on the 5-year strategy and tries to bring it forward, and there is some continuity in this plan with the earlier one that they were unsuccessfully able to implement. But I think the optimism that we saw in 2018 it was really dissipated after the Hanoi summit. And I think after that, the North Korean government, particularly Kim Jong-un, realized that they were going to be facing sanctions indefinitely. It was going to be not an opportunity to open up and get real benefit of economic development, but it was going to be a real constraining situation. And last year in December, at the end of 2019, he had a very interesting meeting of the Central Committee where he really criticized the management of the economy, the need to make systemic changes in the system itself. And I do think this is a plan that is anchored in his commitment to changing the economic system, to making it work better, to get more efficiency out of the domestic economy and productivity, to offset the impact of sanctions, which are really constraining the economy and the ability to mobilize resources. And I think that this plan kind of reflects that sort of assumption that things are not going to get better soon, and they have to become more serious about managing their economy better, and to be, the emphasis on self-reliance, import substitution, and trying to get the system working better. There are two things that struck me about this that I think were interesting. One is the references that I continually read in the KCNA reporting about that the guiding principle or objective of this plan is to make the people first. It's a people first policy. And it really reflects that orientation he had from his very early days of wanting to be in a relationship with the people where he is making their lives better. And his apology that began this whole party Congress reinforced the fact that he's not the dear leader who's a god up there. They talk about the god being the people now. It's a very different formulation. And I think it does reflect an old Confucian value of the reciprocity between the leader and the people, and an expectation of common cause in making their society works better and smoothly. But I also think it ties the legitimacy of his rule to succeeding in delivering on the economy. And the effort to strengthen the role of the state, I think, is a really interesting development. And it reflects a kind of a new accommodation of the relationship of the party and the cabinet, and putting the cabinet in charge, not only of the people's economy, but the military and the party part of this in a more integrated way. And I think that's new. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see whether this a change in approach and a stronger authority being given to the cabinet has traction or not. I think that's an open question at this stage. But from a macroeconomic perspective, this plan to me seems very aspirational. If you look at all the things they say they want to do in 5 years, when they're in a situation where they have sanctions, they have the impact of COVID, the borders are closed, the economy's a mess. It's a very difficult current situation, and they know it. And they know it partly because in the budget that they approved right after the party Congress, they have a budget of less than 1% growth. That's a big shift for them. And it's an acknowledgement that they're in a deep hole, and they have very much more modest expectations of what they can do in the coming year in this situation, where they've got to get out of the pandemic, and then they've got to get some kind of normal, stable economic process going again. But from a macroeconomic perspective, they're going to need trade. There's no way they can meet these objectives without trade. There's no way they can bring nuclear plants and things like that, and without access to foreign technology. And I mean, even the medical equipment they don't have for the hospital they built. I mean, they need trade, they need to have technology, and they need access to money. Mobilizing capital is essential for the kind of investment expectations that this plan has created. And some of that capital might be mobilized domestically, but right now, their way of managing the domestic savings and translating that into investment is primitive. And that's some of the issues in the economic management system they're trying to produce. But their ability to get foreign capital is almost zero now, except through these sanctions evasion techniques. And it's so hard to get money, it's not surprising they're reaching into cyber methods to try to get cash. How else are they going to pay for the oil they're getting in ship-to-ship transfers? So they're in a really difficult position, and cash is king right now. And I think this is affecting both the domestic and the international policy that they're producing. So I think their ability to succeed in this plan is very unlikely unless one of two things happens. Either China comes in big time, much bigger time than they have already this year, and they are able to continue to expand and be successful in their sanctions evasion activities, like what we saw yesterday with the U.S. Claims about their cybersecurity successes. Or if that doesn't happen, and if the world economy is not going to be helpful for them with the COVID impact, then I think they're facing a very difficult future on that front. And it's very dependent on China's willingness and how far they're willing to go. The other option is to find a negotiation process that radically changes the way they work with the rest of the international community. And if that happens, then there may be a path forward. But right now, it's very unclear. The Biden administration is in the middle of a policy review. They're stuck in the middle of a COVID pandemic. The plan does not provide a roadmap for how to get out of the hole where they are today into some kind of more normal economic setting where they can pursue the kind of objectives that the plan provides. So I think it's a nice aspiration, but I think, the realism is going to depend on what happens in the coming months and the way they handle their relationships with both their domestic political economy issues and with their foreign relations issues.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Peter, let me turn to you. So Brad says that North Korea under Kim Jong-un is in a predicament. It's hemmed in by sanctions, or boxed in. And Byung-Yeon mentions that the party Congress, at least the economic orientation, is taking a step back away from the market. How do you see things panning out on the ground? I mean, what's happening to the Dongju? Perhaps whatever growth the North Korean economy had in recent years was due to Dongju financed or Dongju trade or somehow related to the Dongju. What's going on there, Peter?
Oh, well, I think Professor Kim played a large part in popularizing the phrase from Dongju to Bitju in Korean. Basically Dongju means a money master, right? And Bitju means debt master. So the idea is basically since sanctions became far more tight and started to really have an impact on the price at which Dongju enterprises could sell exports to the outside market, and also their ability to get inputs at market prices. So basically the discount rate they had to accept on their exports plus the premium they had to accept on their imports. Once this prices has started to operate, Dongju started to see a lot of their enterprises became unviable. So what I would anyway say is that we people at every level of the bureaucracy, from Kim Jong-un down, face two sets of problems: a chronic set of problems caused by sanctions and an acute set of problems caused by COVID. And right now, the extreme volatility we're seeing in markets, which is definitely going to be impacting a lot of households who are having to pay much higher prices for things like corn and even rice to some extent, who are seeing wild swings in the cost of fuel from week to week and month to month. is going to be, these are acute problems brought on by COVID, but the chronic problems caused by, say, making investments on the basis of a certain price structure and a certain supply chains that existed before sanctions became far tighter in 2016, 2017, were already evident in the economy to some extent before the COVID crisis. And those problems have not gone away and will have certainly become worse as a result of COVID. Then you also have the problem now of government policy and the government reaction, which obviously Professor Kim touched on and Mr. Babson also touched on in passing. The government does seem to be trying to re-centralize control of firm management to some extent. And now it's not fully rolling back reforms that were, sort of drafted and implemented in the 2014-15 period, because those reforms have been written into a lot of laws and into the Constitution. But what it is doing is de-emphasizing firm level autonomy. The impact that will have on Tunju is that basically a lot of practices they're involved in, which were either legalized or else at least tolerated by a great degree of regulatory forbearance, are now potentially in the crosshairs of anti-socialist crackdowns on anti-socialist behavior, which we also saw Kim Jong-un himself refer to in his speech. We've seen referred to in other cabinet speeches and in a lot of media coverage that has surrounded the Congress and then the second plenary meeting of the 8th Central Committee, which was held last week at some point. I can't remember the exact dates. But what this all means is that Tunju and market actors are sort of hemmed in on all sides, as it were. Chronically, they face long-term structural problems as a result of sanctions. Shorter run, they face the demand and supply shocks induced by COVID and basic, sort of North Korea government enforced embargo on foreign trade, and now they also face the growing pains that seem to be, well, from our point of view, self-inflicted by the government on the market. So the government, with its anti-socialist campaigns, trying to curtail the autonomy and discretion of firm managers, and by extension also the autonomy and discretion of market actors. So things do not look good, to sum things up bluntly and directly. Things really do not look good.
Okay. Let me just get a quick follow-up. The Donju, where did they make their money originally? From trade with China, and then did they start making their money from financing activities in Pyongyang and North Korea?
So this is the center of a debate that is very looms large in the Korean language literature on the North Korean economy. It's less pronounced in the English language literature, but it's did marketization start from above or did it start from below? So was it well-connected party cadres and people within the foreign trade bureaucracy who amassed fortunes and who propelled this sort of process of marketization, or was it people at the bottom, or people at the bottom and the middle who started roadside stalls and small-scale restaurants and very small, like sort of marketized state firms who built up cash holdings. I mean, it's difficult to tell which side of the equation is more important, but as in both do exist and both are important. So people who have connections to the outside world via family, or who are just very entrepreneurial and very, very talented, but who don't come from power and connections, are clearly prominent within the Donju, and especially at the regional and local levels. But at the center, of course, in Pyongyang and in the central party bureaucracy, there are a lot of people who use their connections to make serious money as well. With respect to whether they are more export-oriented or foreign trade-oriented or domestic-oriented, yes, again, I don't have a clear answer for you there. But there are definitely going to be Donju, quite a lot of them, no doubt, who are involved in export industries who have been very seriously hurt by sanctions.
Okay.
It seems to be a little doubt in my mind that that's the case.
Right. Okay.
And
good.
by extension, even if you're not directly involved in exports, if a trade shock hits the economy, it's going to potentially hit you indirectly as well. So.
Right. Well, we just have to make our best guesses with North Korea, given the lack of data and transparency. Let me turn to another. Let me attack this problem from a slightly different angle. So the so-called reform characterized by the rise of the Donju during the good times for the Donju, pre-COVID times, reminds me of the situation that the Soviet system faced under Gorbachev and countries in the Soviet bloc like Bulgaria under Zhivkov faced. That is, they moved into a situation, a partial relaxation that left the economy neither controlled sufficiently to function in the old way, nor sufficiently free to function through market activity. A limbo situation, right? Neither system lasted long, and the way out for both countries was a reorientation towards the international financial community. I'd like to turn to Byung-Yeon. So you made the comment that North Korea is not autarkic. It is outward oriented, at least it was before it shut its borders. But what's going on? What would it take for North Korea to really orient itself towards the international financial community? It's one question. And related to that, is there a role for inter-Korean cooperation, perhaps as a intermediate step before North Korea opens up to the international financial community?
Yeah, before the sanctions imposed in 2016, I estimate trade dependence ratio in North Korea was about 50%. That was quite close to world average in the same period. But now it's declined drastically because of decrease in trade. But the choices are up to North Korean policymakers, Kim Jong-un's choice, basically, whether he make progress in denuclearization. Then I think it's this economic cooperation between South and North Koreas can start. Also, there is serious progress in denuclearization. North Korea may be able to join international financial organizations led by IMF. That's what we want. I wonder whether this is feasible or this is possible at current stage. I think it's well-designed economic cooperation between two Koreas and between North Korea and international community can contribute to North Korea's transition to market economy and opening up. But there are some conditions. Necessary condition is, of course, North Korea should make progress in denuclearization. Then sanctions can be lifted or relaxed accordingly. A sufficient condition is that those Korean authorities are willing to accept or agree to such cooperation. If this, sorry, I will take some water. If these two conditions are met, there will be plenty of opportunities for economic cooperation. And North Korea is able to export and import. North Korea workers may be employed by foreign firms, including South Korea, and foreign capital will flow into North Korea. And North Korea will be able to join international financial organizations as a member. Also, there are some synergy effect can be expected between South Korea and North Korea. Maybe it's a big project, but if there is a complete denuclearization, and if North Koreans agree to accept economic cooperation, I thought of international management and development of North Korea's mineral resources, including coal and uranium. If uranium is managed by international organizations, then I think a permanent denuclearization is possible. And revenue from such project can be used to support North Korea's economic development and transition to market economy. But this is big sort of picture. But if necessary condition is met, I mean denuclearization, but not a sufficient one. If North Koreans are unwilling or reluctant to accept this cooperation, that will be a challenge for international community to develop effective cooperation projects, because Kim Jong-un's interest lie in keeping his regime by making easy money. I think from his perspective, tourism is attractive because it is not regime penetrating or thus politically safe. But if we agree to tourism, I mean big project of tourism, we should exchange it for important denuclearization, perhaps at the last stage of denuclearization or at the stage of irreversible denuclearization. From the future of Korean Peninsula, one of the best projects may be the employment of North Korean workers by South Korean enterprises. In this way, North Korean workers are exposed to market economy and are able to improve their human capital. But this could be regime undermining from North Korea's perspective. So one polar is basically tourism. The other polar is that employment of North Korean workers by South Korean or international foreign firms. But there are various projects between these bipolar choices, which may be exchanged equivalently for North Korea's step of denuclearization. One of the economic cooperation that can start the early stage of North Korea's denuclearization, such as abolition of Yongbyon facility, may be the restart of Kaesong industrial complex, but with the new institutional settings, such as free customs, communication, and travel that did not exist before 2016. And also we have to emphasize direct payment of wages to North Korean workers. It will be much better if South Korea and United States revise its FTA agreement in a way that the goods produced in Kaesong in the complex are recognized as South Korea's exports. So this kind of projects can be early start when there is some progress in denuclearization, such as the abolition of Yongbyon facility. Construction of power plants in North Korea, about which there has been heated debate in South Korea recently, can be considered, but I think it should be exchanged with North Korea's complete denuclearization. Why is that? Because it may be used to strengthen the socialist economy by allocating energy produced by these power plants to allocate this electricity to, say, state-owned enterprises, not private ones. That is, reform can be undermined. Also, North Korea may be reluctant in further denuclearization if it feels economically safe or secure by having sufficient supply of energy. So that has come at the last stage of denuclearization. The most difficult question is, what if North Korea partially denuclearizes? Not completely, but Kim Jong-un is unwilling to accept any kind of cooperation which aims at the sort of reform or transition. Yeah, we can perhaps have to think about this situation carefully and how to design economic cooperation in a way that induces internal changes in North Korea and so reduces the probability of military conflict. This kind of situation should be considered as well. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Let me, well, that's certainly very intriguing, that last point you made, Professor Kim. Let me turn it over to Brad now. So Professor Kim has said that the prospects for economic development hinge on a willingness and ability to reform. And Professor Kim has said that the ability is constrained by North Korea's nuclear weapons status. So he can't get the international community on board because of that. But what about the willingness? Brad, you said something that it seemed a bit odd to me, that Kim Jong-un is going out to factory managers and kind of blaming them for the poor state of the North Korean economy. I mean, isn't he in charge? Isn't he the supreme leader there?
He wasn't complaining about
the So what will it take for Kim Jong-un or North Korean leaders to really develop the willingness to reform. If we can set aside the political ability, that's a big constraint.
I see a lot in what they've been saying is saying they're very willing to change the system. They don't use the word reform, but I don't, and they talk about innovation. They've been very strong on decentralization. The main complaining has been about cabinet officials who just are old-minded and not imaginative about being creative, about finding new and better ways to do things. That's where his main criticisms have been. A lot of the enterprise managers of the state have been just as imaginative as private entrepreneurs. I visited a factory in the state factory, and he said he produces for the market and he produces for the state, and he takes extra money and he invested in expanding the business and paying his employees better. You know, that's a state manager, and this was 10 years ago, almost 8 years ago. I mean, there's a real dynamism in the enterprise sector, and I don't think Kim Jong-un is trying to squelch that. He's trying to direct it and mobilize it to focus on things of national importance. And I think that issue of the relationship of the state to the economic actors, both state and non-state, is really at the heart of his effort to get the system working better and more in line with what the national objectives are, just the way most countries work. Look at ours right now. But I think the key thing for me is that we just don't know enough about how they think and what they're trying to do. They've been prioritizing economic development for years, and nobody talks to them about it. I don't know of any high-level, senior-level discussion taking place between senior cabinet, financial, economic officials and knowledgeable economic and financial people outside of North Korea. There was that one little visit to Pyongyang in 2018 when some chaebol heads came and they sat down with the cabinet to talk about deals. But that's the only level of expansion. For me, the first thing would be to create some way of getting in conversation with people who are trying to make the economy work better and understand. There's a mutual learning there. And I think our ignorance is a big part of the problem of understanding what they're trying to do and how to talk with them about the future and our ways we could cooperate. And I think the answer to that is we've got to build into both the diplomatic process and track 2 a much more willingness to talk about economic things and not just nuclear things. They need to be integrated better. And I would also argue that post-pandemic, human security is going to be on front and center on everybody's minds. It's not just about nuclear weapons. It's about how do we manage pandemics and the impacts of those on all of us. And prioritizing engaging around human security, which is clearly a high priority for theirs. They were willing to sacrifice economy to protect the people under COVID, just the way other countries have. And so I think we need to understand that beginning a discussion about how to help build a more resilient health system and a more sustainable food security situation is a very good starting point for a different kind of dialogue between the international community and the North Koreans. Right now, they're asking for help with vaccines and things, and now's the time to respond to that in a constructive way. And the other thing is in thinking about security negotiations on the military side, you know, and both the missiles and the nuclear, I think it's very important to recognize that economic security has to be part of the larger security equation and has to be addressed in a meaningful way, not just in dealing with the military security issues. And it needs to be much more centrally engaged, a part of the whatever diplomatic process comes. And you look at the 6-party framework, and everybody could agree on denuclearization objectives, but everybody had a very different policy on how to relate to North Korea in terms of economic relations and engagement. And there needs to be more coherence in the international community, particularly those states who are most closely involved in the nuclear discussions, about integrating a more common approach on economic conversation with North Korea with the denuclearization conversation. I do think there's a role for the UN and the IFIs in human security in a very preliminary way of helping to address these key things. And I think if you get a serious dialogue going on denuclearization, that bringing the IFIs in is actually more helpful because they're politically neutral and they have expertise and competencies that the North Koreans respect. I visited North Korea as a World Bank person for the first and only World Bank mission back in 1998. My host was the Ministry of Finance. It was not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All of my meetings were with economic people, and it was quite possible for me to have very frank and open discussions with economic officials about their situation, their hopes, what their concerns were, and what possible areas of mutual interest could be explored. And that was over 20 years ago. And I think they're much more competent to have those conversations today than they were back then. So my argument would be to bring the IFI community into the diplomatic process in a limited way early on, not unlike the way the IMF and the World Bank were involved in the Myanmar transition process. There were conversations occurring in parallel with the political negotiations and the economic dialogue. And I think that some kind of formulation that is more realistic at integrating economic and political discussions would help advance the overall longer term agenda.
Okay, well, that certainly gives us a lot to think about. But right now, Professor Kim has said that the Eighth Party Congress has taken a step back away from reform, maybe adapting to its international circumstances with North Korea. But it seems to say, Bradley, that you're about to say, or maybe you're thinking that Kim Jong-un could have a Deng Xiaoping moment where he could come out and say, to get rich is glorious. It's a way to work around the way officials, particularly in Beijing and central government, hindered reform in China after the first decade. Do you think is that inconceivable, or could you see Kim Jong-un really breaking out and taking a really bold step in reform in North Korea?
I think if the political dialogue goes in a way that it builds enough confidence that he's not going to have the rug pulled out from him again, which he felt in Hanoi, he could do that. And I also think it's in our interest because they're right now surviving by sanctions evasion, and they're surviving by in untransparent ways of meeting their needs and corruption. And if we want them to be a more normal country, we have to give them a way to get out of that kind of behavior and into a more normal way of doing business and raising money and working with other economic partners. And there's a push-pull there. There's a bit good cop, bad cop, but it's not just about denuclearization. It's about getting them out of all of these other bad ways that they try to meet their needs, and providing them with a ramp to a different kind of a future than the one they've been living. And that has to go along with sanctions relief and economic development support. But that kind of a process requires major strategic decisions, both on the part of North Korea's leadership and on the part of the international community, about what they're prepared to do to help make a transition like that realistic and not just nice words.
Right. Okay. Well, I certainly agree with the former, that it does require decisions on North Korea's leadership. I think we saw that everywhere else when the Soviet Union broke apart, even when the Soviet Union collapsed. But turning to Peter, in 2 minutes, we're running over our 30 minutes. How are things? You read a lot of the regulations. Could you extrapolate from the evolution of regulations to either support or to contest Brad's view that Kim Jong-un has the willingness somewhere deep inside him to become a true reformer?
Started my timer, so I've got 2 minutes on the clock starting now. I'm afraid I'm much more pessimistic about the regulatory environment and the general attitude of the North Korean government with respect to reform than I think Mr. Babson is. I imagine that having read Professor Kim's recent work, I imagine we're very much of the same view, unfortunately, which is that in 2018, the North Koreans had already started to scale back foreign trade reform, i.e. reforms which allowed enterprises to trade directly with foreign entities or seek foreign investment from foreign entities. That was in 2018. That was before, it was before before Hanoi, and before the sort of the collapse of US DPRK negotiations. So even as long ago as 3 years ago, things were were already heading towards retrenchment. I would also say that the scale of the initial reforms was less dramatic than myself and some other people thought, having looked at some of the internal documents from the time since that have been published. It seems that basically firms were less were allowed to use markets in less sort of less dramatic ways than I had originally thought. But the tone of the coverage of the Congress this year and the editorials that have come out of Rodong Shimin since indicate that they are quite serious about trying to re-centralize decision making with respect to output targets, but even with respect to things like industrial, the allocation of inputs, the allocation of funding, finance, funds, and labor. There is this general tone of trying to. I'm almost done with my 2 minutes. General tone of trying to clamp down on anti-socialist activities, which are explicitly includes the economic realm. So illegal money making is how they describe it in editorials in Rodong Shimin, the party newspaper. So I think that the attitude towards reforms and markets is much more negative than it has been for some time.
Right. So the ability of the Donju and people, maybe factory managers and whatnot, to experiment is a lot more constrained, I would say, than I guess we saw in other countries like China. Well, you would agree, right, Peter? That's what I take from what you're saying. So. Okay, Jonathan, we used up more than 30 minutes, but I think it's time for the Q&A now.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks to everybody that's watching and has been sending in your questions. We have a lot. And I'm going to do my best to move this process along quickly so that we can get to as many questions as possible. We really appreciate your interest, and we want to reciprocate your engagement by recognizing as many people as we can. So let's start with the first question from Phil Sherman, and I'll direct this at you, Byung-Yeon. South Korea's development model, to what extent can it be a teaching moment for North Korea? Of course, sanctions prohibit a lot of the things that South Korea has been able to do, like export-led manufacturing, but are there some lessons there for North Korea?
For the sake of time, I'll be brief. Well, South Korea has developed on the basis of export. Export has been based on low wages and competitive exchange rates. And if North Korea alone has developed its economy, it has to consider this kind of policy. Export is key, but to export, you have to bear low wages, and you have to also install competitive exchange rates. But before it, they have to liberalize exchange rates, adopting a fixed one or free floating one, and this kind of institutional environment to be settled beforehand. But I think this kind of approach is 1960s, 70s. If North Korea is really willing to accept economic cooperation with South Korea, then I think this is 21st century leapfrogging strategy is possible. Say, South Korean firms invest in various parts of North Korea, and then some kind of experiments of new technologies, a smart city, or vehicles without any, the people. This kind of new technologies can be experimented in some parts in North Korea, and North Korea has some advantage because it has no existing stakeholders preventing this kind of new technology from spreading. Also, North Korea is basically clean in terms of air pollution, etc. this kind of situation can be combined with South Korea's technology, such as world-class medical service. And this new thinking made possible if North Korea is willing to accept serious economic cooperation with South Korea.
Interesting. That second mover point is especially interesting. Brad, do you have anything to follow up on with that question?
Two quick points. One is, one of the things that South Korea did that was very noteworthy was they put economic technocrats in charge of the economy and kept the military particularly out of the way, particularly in the early years. And I think it's interesting right now with the decisions that are being made to really empower the cabinet in a way that they've never been empowered before, whether they're trying to take a leaf out of the South Korean book to find a way to get the economy working better. So that's question. I don't know, but that's interesting. The other thing is around the evolution of the enterprise sector. South Korea went the road of tribals, and large horizontally integrated firms where a profitable side of the business could subsidize an unprofitable side, but that was needed for the purposes of the national development strategy. And there seemed to be some indications of movement in that direction in the state enterprise sector, which I think would be something that would be correlated with seeing whether they could do things the way the South Koreans have done them. On the other hand, for some years, they've been pushing a competitiveness policy in light industry, particularly in the production of consumer goods for the markets, where the government's been trying to stimulate competition rather than create large monopolies. So I think there's some very interesting questions about where the enterprise evolution is going to go with whatever policy direction they're getting from the state now.
Great. And I forgot to mention that question came to us from Phil Sherman. He's a board director of the Korea study, and he worked for Citibank in Korea in the 1970s. So he was very much a part of South Korea's development. The next question I'm going to point at you, Peter. It comes from Dukin Han, a reporter at RFA. Any thoughts about the latest cyber news? The U.S. Justice Department indictment that accuses North Korea of stealing more than $1.3 billion from banks and crypto hubs. Any thought about how that figures into the economic strategy of North Korea?
Well, in the short run, it seems like a coping mechanism. Generally speaking, if to echo something Mr. Babson said earlier, as in if you can't do anything legally, then you do what is profitable but illegal. It also speaks to North Korean ingenuity. If you took all of those people who are currently busy hacking and stealing and put them to work doing something legal, imagine how much value they could create. So it's obviously very grim news, but at the same time, it speaks to North Korea's place within the global economy at present. But it also indicates that there is a lot of talent in that country that is being used for illicit and destructive purposes that could, if it's put to productive uses, could become engines of growth for North Korea's future.
Yep. Interesting point. Anybody want to make a follow-on point there, Byung-Yeon and Brad, on the cyber?
Well, okay, I said earlier that right now what they're most strapped for is money. They can't get it internationally, and it's almost impossible to get domestically given the current situation. So they're really pushing to find ways to get the government's hands on cash. And this is one of the ways that they're finding some success. And it's not surprising that they're going to ramp it up if they can. As I said, if they're going to be purchasing oil through ship-to-ship transfers, they have to pay for it. And how are they going to? They're not allowed to export anything that earns much money these days. And this is the only strategy they've got right now that can generate real cash.
Thank you. And yeah, Byung-Yeon.
I guess the annual trade deficit is about $2 billion in 2019. I think it's the one part or half of this deficit was perhaps covered by this kind of activities, including cyber, hacking, tourists from China, dispatched workers still in Russia and in China. And this kind of activities can cover some part of this trade deficit. If it really becomes big, then there will be big loophole in sanction regime. But I wonder this kind of cyber attack is all that successful. I think just a small portion of this money they attempt to steal was cashed out. It's very difficult to cash out and bring into North Korea. Okay.
Interesting, good point. And we had Priscilla Moriucci, who's at Recorded Future and used to work for the NSA, come and give a talk to us about North Korea's cyber attack. She's also up in Maine there, Brad, so maybe you've bumped into her. But she gave us a fascinating talk on all the enterprising ways that North Korea is out there trying to earn money through cyber and illicit means. And Peter, I think it speaks to your point that there's so much that these people could be doing if not for the present situation. I want to turn to a question about which sectors of the economy have adjusted best to the constraints of international sanctions. This is a question that comes to us from Guy Aragoni, and let's turn to Byung-Yeon for the first response.
I look at the Serbian refugees settled down in South Korea, and I look at the effect of the sanctions and the pandemic on household income expenditure, dividing the groups into several occupations. Actually, I found that, as Peter said, the hardest hit was on former traders, foreign traders. The second followed retail traders, but neither foreign trade nor domestic trade, this kind of occupation survived very well. Their median income has not changed. That means maybe food industry and consumer good industry have survived fairly well, but that does not mean that they haven't reduced activities, but it is reduced, but not that much, I guess, because supply chain is short, and this is very domestic demand-oriented. Therefore, consumer good industry and food industries have survived fairly well.
Thank you.
Brad, just to follow up on that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Two finger from Peter. Yeah.
Sorry. I would just add as well, there are certain sectors that are not very dependent on foreign inputs. So, for instance, large parts of the food industry are people's back gardens and mountainsides, and they don't rely on many foreign inputs. They don't rely on spare parts for their tractors. This is quite, unfortunately, quite primitive stuff, but as a result, sanctions are unlikely to have a particularly large impact. The weather may have a large impact, which we obviously saw earlier in the summer, but if you are growing corn in your back garden or on the local mountain or on a collectively, semi-collectively organized plot in your local state enterprise, then you're unlikely to be particularly affected by sanctions compared to, say, a large foreign trade company that exports coal.
Right. Good point. Brad?
Just a couple of points. One is coal. Coal was sanctioned for export, but there's been an effort to redeploy coal for domestic purposes, and gasification is one of them that they've invested in pretty heavily to offset the loss of oil needed, for example, fertilizer production and other industrial uses. Also, there are other smaller uses of coal that have been directed to the domestic economy, part of the import substitution strategy. But there has been a reorientation of the coal industry in response to the sanctions. Similarly, as far as the markets are concerned, the sanctions on export of textiles and fishery, for example, there's been some redeployment of those seafood and textiles into the domestic markets as opposed to foreign markets, and that's contributed in a sense to an improvement in some of the quality of goods available in the markets for North Korean people, and I think there's also been effort to as part of the self-reliance movement to encourage consumer good production for the markets to replace what is otherwise being imported from China in various types of commodities. So I think there's been an effort to sort of reorient things that are related to the consumption markets within North Korea that are trying to adapt in ways that are probably positive in some respects. And the other is the construction industry. You know, when they had the storms last summer, they built a lot of houses pretty quickly. Again, those two things don't require a lot of imported inputs, so that their effort on construction has seemed to go fairly along, you know, more or less normal lines. Has a lot of labor involved in that.
Okay, I want to get to two more questions, and we're going to really squeeze them in here. One's about Pak Peng-ju, so get your minds going about Pak Peng-ju. This comes from Scott Snyder, our friend, senior fellow of Korea Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he wants to know, can the North Korean economy grow without Pak Peng-ju in charge? Is this the reformer that he is reputed to be, or is he something else? Anybody have some thoughts on that one? Peter, I see you laughing the most, so I'm gonna turn to
I used to be Pak Peng-ju's biggest cheerleader. I've gone a bit quieter on that front in recent years, but I do think if you look at the current premier, you know, originally a factory manager from one of the country's major industrial enterprises, the Taean Taean electrical machinery combine, you still see the personnel in place who potentially, if they were given the discretion to do so, could devise new economic reforms. You know, the problem is not the one man in charge of the cabinet. The problem is how much discretion they're given by the central party bureaucracy and by Kim Jong-un himself to actually devise and implement interesting new experiments and then build those experiments out to broader reforms. And I just don't see much appetite for that right now at the very top. We see quite the reverse, unfortunately. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Anybody else have any other thoughts on Pak Peng-ju?
Well, I would just say that I think the competency that existed within the country to think creatively about reform and innovative ways to do things is a lot broader than it used to be. And so there's a reservoir of talent that can be drawn upon if there's a political will to be more reform oriented. I also think that there is a lot of high level rhetoric about encouraging innovation, and there is a real effort to stimulate innovation at the local level, at the enterprise level, to come up with new approaches to do things. That was a theme that they picked on over and over again in the party Congress discussions, and that links to the education system and the sense that people are empowered to be creative in ways that mean something in a micro context.
Okay, now we're going to go to China. Of course, North Korea's predominant trade partner, Jeffrey Tao, would like to know, what will be China's role in the future DPRK economy? So looking a little bit forward, maybe past the COVID-induced border closures, is the relationship going to change for the better, for the worse? Is there a possible involvement of China to help spur on North Korean reform and opening, a la Deng Xiaoping, as Tom mentioned before? What do we think about that?
I mean, I think in the short run, China's role is going to be a continued source of aid and a continued source of support. Longer run, yes, they will provide expertise, know-how, and potentially investment if they feel able to do so, especially on the investment front. I mean, there is a lot of interaction between the two sides that we don't know about and that is kept private. But I imagine that given how well managed the North Korean exchange rate has been in recent years, there's been a lot of support from the Chinese on that front in one form or another. And I imagine that continued support in the form of expertise and some goods going across the border, some aid, will probably continue. Longer run, it all hinges on how the nuclear discussions go and what happens to sanctions. If we were to see a significant relaxation, I think China would probably support major investment in infrastructure in the country. There'd be a lot of additional investment in the mining sector probably, and they would probably start also looking to outsource more of their light industrial production as China continues to move up the value chain and the lower value stuff has to be done somewhere else. But that's all contingent on obviously progress on the nuclear front.
Right. Okay. Other thoughts there?
Just that China, as a neighbor, there are things that North Korea can produce that China needs. So there are economic motivators, not just political motivators, to any future economic relationship. And it's probably going to be eventually more driven by the economic motivators rather than political ones. if things work out. Depends on where things go.
Gotcha. Byung-Yeon, any thoughts on this one?
Right. China is very important, in terms of trade partner and in terms of potential investors. Also, I hope that Kim Jong-un may be persuaded by Chinese to be like Deng Xiaoping. Then I think it's great. Having said that, from the North Korea perspective, just reliance on China too much may not be beneficial a lot. I look at the impact of Chinese trade on North Korea's economy in terms of human capital development and the value added. And actually, it is not that positive. North Korea has been exporting mineral resources, fish. This include not that much human capital contents and value addition. So if North Korea trade only with China, I think it's the opportunities to upgrade their human capital and technology may be limited. That's why they have to diversify trade and investment, with other countries, South Korea and Japan, etc.
Very good point. I know that Justin Hastings down in Australia did some really interesting survey research of Chinese entrepreneurs that are doing business in North Korea, and the hope and expectation was that perhaps their business in North Korea would start to transform from the inside their North Korean business partners, vendors, customers, etc. Instead, what their survey research bore out was that the reverse impact was happening. The North Korean business environment was forcing them to adapt North Korean style business practices. So the hoped for effect was not resulting. I want to say thank you to all of our audience members who sent questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. So that includes Maud, Easter, James Lee, John Dixon, Brian Gold, and Shashank Patel. Some of you asked about things that we touched upon tangentially. Others, I'm sorry that we didn't get to this time, but please keep tuning in. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. I mean, for me, this was a tremendous learning opportunity, and I think for many others as well. You put on quite a clinic. And so we are very appreciative. Thank you very much. Thanks to Tom for his great job moderating. Thanks for Peter for all the work that he does to make this production possible. Thanks to Stephen Norper for helping to sort of guide the way that this program series, this Uni Korea program series goes along. Please join us March 4th. We've got a program on inter-Korean relations with Jean Lee from the Wilson Center. That's moderated by Stephen Norper, and we hope to see you then. Thanks very much. Have a good night, everybody.